how does it happen that when you hit insert a pivot table, your pivot table appears in a new worksheet? You can imagine that whenever you hit insert and a pivot table, the whole range of data that you've selected and that you can see right now in the first field of pivot table creation, the whole range is somehow copied inside your Microsoft Excel and pasted into a specific place, a memory of Excel, where the data is stored for the second time. This is kind of strange thing usually when you first discover that. Your data, your source data is stored right now in the worksheet, but to make it quite easy for a pivot table to access the data, to analyze the data quickly, switch between the fields, filter the data and so on, what Excel does, it creates another instance of your data somewhere in your memory. A proof for that, if I would remove, don't do it, from my solution file, the data worksheet where I store my data, I still am able to change something in my exercise 1.2. For example, if I place the transport type on the filters shelf and select the land, you will see that my pivot table is recalculated, although the data in here doesn't exist anymore. Let me now go back to my data worksheet from the backup and let's discuss how to refresh a pivot table whenever your data source changes. Let's do the following. Let's insert a new pivot table and let's analyze the sum of sales by order priority. You can see that once again we reach the grand total of 31 million, and what you can find are 5 priorities on the list in here. Now, when we go back to our source table and we will change the data, for example, instead of low value in the D2 cell, let's insert the missing category. There is no order priority right now. If you go back to your pivot table, you won't see any change applied automatically. The reason for that is this pivot table cache, the specific memory of a pivot table, which stores the data separately from your initial data worksheet data source. So how to make this change applied to this pivot table? You need to find the refresh button somewhere around your pivot table. For example, you can right click it and find the refresh in here. The other way is to go for the data tab and find refresh all, or you will also find the refresh icon somewhere on the pivot table specific tabs, like analyze and design data of a pivot table. All the elements lead to the refresh icon, and after hitting refresh, you will get the missing category available in your pivot table. Okay, the data has been updated, but what about new rows that we will add somewhere below the current data source? At the moment, we end at the line 9427, so let's add a new row of data just by creating a new entry, new order priority in the row 9428. If we go back right now to the pivot table and once again hit refresh, nothing's going to happen. Why is that? If you insert a pivot table, your Excel guesses, if you don't select any specific table or range, Excel guesses what is the content of your source table. And right now you can see it's showing us 9,428 rows instead of 27. Why is that? Because right now Excel can see the last added row. So if I would create a new pivot table, the new row would be in there. It doesn't happen, although, to the pivot tables you've already created. And if you would like this new row to be applied to your old pivot table, you need to go to the pivot table analyze tool and change the data source for the existing pivot table. So let's do it. And instead of giving just 9,427, let's change it to 28. And by hitting OK, you can right now see that we have a new row, a new order priority without any sales, but it's not a problem right now. The problem is that if you go back to your previous pivot tables, like in the exercise 1.1 or 1.2, these pivot tables did not change because they are treated separately by Microsoft Excel. So you'd have to right now go every single pivot table one by one and change this range of source for every pivot table you have. There are a few ways how to deal with that. Some of the users, for example, instead of placing new rows below the pivot table, insert a row in between. By doing so, every pivot table is expanding. The same applies also not only to the rows but also to columns. If you create a new column entry at the end of the table, it's not going to appear on your column list. But if you insert a new column in here and call it new, after refreshing your pivot table will get the new table. But these are just some more advanced tricks that you might find useful at some level. But there is always a better way to do it, a better way even to start working with pivot tables. What is that? Certainly, it is not selecting the whole columns you have in here, what some Excel users do, because by doing so, you maybe keep your pivot table ready for the new rows, but instead of just placing only the rows you are interested in, you place also a lot of empty rows inside your A to X columns in my example. So this is not a good practice, and this is not the recommended approach to select all columns without any rows as the data source, because it's going to slow down your pivot table. So what to do? Let me just first remove all of the unnecessary rows and columns. And instead of just going for the insert pivot table, let's use the object called a table. I've shown the table object during the formulas and data operation course. So if you haven't taken that course yet, then look for it on the internet. And we will create the table that will contain headers as it's marked right now. And you can see and distinguish the table object by usually the formatting of the cells, the default formatting. And right now, whenever I insert a pivot table, you can see that I'm trying to insert the pivot table on not a specific range of cells, but on a table. And the table have a self-expanding feature which will allow me to easily add new rows, new columns, and it's always going to cover all of my pivot tables whenever I refresh them. So first, let's create a table. Then let's create some kind of analysis like the order priority and sales. And right now I'm going to add a new row on the bottom of my table. It's called right now new. You can see it's below my table, but whenever I hit enter, you can see that the self-expanding of the table object is happening. And when I right now go back to my pivot table, it's not going to appear in here automatically because I have not updated the pivot table yet. But whenever I hit refresh, you can see this new row. Usually this is not just a single row, these are many new rows appearing in the analysis. But what is more, if you insert a new column in there, I will call it also new. And whenever you refresh your pivot table, this new column is going to appear automatically also on your pivot table fields list. So summing up this exercise, if you would like to create a pivot table and then reuse it, add new rows, add new columns, work a lot with different pivot tables, a good practice is to not to use a range of cells, but instead use a table object as the data source for your table. This is how you guarantee that all of your new rows and new columns will automatically, after refreshing of course, appear on your pivot table. Let's now add something new to the layout of a pivot table. For example, if your pivot table fields disappear even though you stand on a pivot table, don't worry, there is always a way to restore it by going to Pivot Table Analyze tab and selecting the field list. This is one of the biggest drama of the beginner pivot table users. I don't see field list. You can always restore it if you close it, and you can also find a few additional features like the search bar, which is brand new in Excel 2016 and 365 as I recall correctly, but you can also find a few ways how you can work with the layout of the pivot tables. I usually stick to the default one, but you can always find a different layout. Maybe some is going to be more interesting to you. I usually stick to the default one. What is more, you can also take out the whole pane and create a new pane a bit larger than what we have by default, and at the end you can also find a way to bring it back to the right. And the last common and the last good practice as regards the data source for a pivot table. Your pivot table can also get data from an external data source. You can see it whenever you insert a pivot table that there is also an option for the external data source. But we will not discuss this because this topic is also covered separately in the dedicated lesson in the Power Query course, where I talk about the connections between a Power Query and how to create a pivot table straight on a Power Query. If you don't know Power Query, don't worry, we will not talk about it inside this course, but if you're interested in, just have a look on another course